Smudge the Lanolin Sky, a short story. Tragic news arrives one sunny morning. The emptiness induced by the hilltop, the vast ether, the great waste of capeweed deadheads, the shapeless granite, the twisted gum trees, on certain given mornings, this one included, would sometimes fill Sylvia of the Glades with an unaccountable dread, strange and original, cosmic even, such that her nape would bristle with strange presence, and it seemed as though nature itself spied upon her from no obvious angle. It made her shiver, it made her want to run. She lived alone in her shack on her unforgiving acre, and made a habit of her aloneness, and hated wearing shoes. But sometimes the massive spread of the hills at the rear seemed primordial in its agoraphobic menace. When the menace loomed, she gazed across the long triangle of farmlets and tried to find an easiness in the simple arrangement of things. It was to no avail, though, because Roger, her black billy goat, was not to be seen in any of the valleys or erosion gullies, which could only mean that, yet again, he had outwitted the electric fence and grazed his way to Ron Gon's rich spread of creek-flat lucerne. So the simple arrangement of things was not quite as simple or arranged as it ought to be. It was a tiresome ritual. Sometime in the night or upon the dawn, Roger, in his frisky wonder, would defy his restraints and make off for greener pastures, much as billy goats will. In the worst-case scenario, he would devour Ron Gon's vegetables and fruit trees, or the rose patch much prized and lovingly tended by Ron's wife, Yvonne. More often, he would burrow under the average fencing along Lucas Road and spend the morning gobbling the dark green alfalfa knobs as if it was his majestic prerogative, until, worst-case scenario, he was overcome with bloat. Sylvia, forsaking her glades, would need to go and fetch him and apologise to Ron and Yvonne again, feeling like an unaccomplished hippie. Ron referred to her adventure as homesteading. Roger was a test of wills. She set out, therefore, this morning, barefooted, determined to return her Billy to his pen, and perhaps stitch up the fence on Lucas Road again, with her pocket full of makeshift orange hayband. There were better ways to spend the morning. Spring was in its fitful carooning. There had been a spit of rain overnight, and so the soil was soft and warm and moist. It would not remain thus for very long. Summertime presses on the heavens, and the long months of dry turpitude descend very quickly. Less so for Ron and Yvonne. Further down the valley, against the wall of the state forest, the moisture lingers longer, and everything stays green or greenish into mid-December. That was usually the time that Roger went astray, but rich nibbles of Ron Gon's lucerne might entice him any time. No amount of hay and supplements could dissuade him, such is the wantonness of billies. It was a bother, but she whistled as she walked and noted the purple chocolate lilies and little golden starbursts poking skyward on the pathside. The great cosmic vista from the hilltop and the enormous geology is less overwhelming, less unnerving down within the valley. And there she just felt like a child of time, skipping pebbles and throwing frisbees in her mind. She came to the farmhouse, and knocking on the back door was greeted by Yvonne, whistling in her kitchen, clad in her apron along with the wafting aroma of floral orange cake. In the distance, visible from the step, was, sure enough, bearded Roger in his swarthy merry, nostril deep in pasture, and thankfully not causing mayhem in the garden. "There he is," said Sylvia, predictably. If she turned up at the doorstep at orange cake time, it was almost always in pursuit of her billy goat, and not for social reasons. Ron and Yvonne were perhaps 20 years her elder. She classified in that category called young people, deserving of amused tolerance and some advanced understanding. Her aversion to shoes was a case in point. "That goat again," smiled Yvonne, and she pointed out that, goat or not, morning tea would be on the table in half an hour or so, and she, Sylvia, would be very welcome, and added that Ron, she called him the Major, was in the farther paddock blowing up tree stumps with his supply of trusty TNT. Roger, quite evidently, was ridiculously agile. To corral him took two, thus the imposition. On such mornings the young woman needed olden Ron, the Major, if she was to herd the beastie in a corner. Ron, for his part, regarded billy goats as a homesteader's liability, but it was another matter for good-natured merit, even though he'd laugh and point out the biological obviousness that she could not even milk him. The best he did, this goat, was climb under her shack and ram his knucklehead upon the floorboards like a lunatic in the middle of a moonlit night. Why any girl would want to keep one, Ron really didn't know. But he was a man of cordial departments. He saw the funny side of things. A long career in the army gave him that. And there was the obligation to save his crop of lucerne from inauspicious development if he could. It was bad enough that wallabies saw fit to feast upon it every sunset. He knew the ritual. He'd be chasing Roger around in circles with Sylvia of the Glades until they could trap him against a solid length of fencing and slip a harness around his wretched neck and then deal with his smelly disposition. Hobby farming, though, is always a matter of quid pro quo. Thanking Yvonne and complimenting her on the aroma of her orange cake, Sylvia trooped outward, and when she encountered old Ron, adorned in his khaki kook hat and whistling brightly a chorus or two of My Gorgeous Lassie of Glasgow, he said, "You're just in time, young lady," for he had stump blasting to conclude, and then some lambing that might, he thought, be somewhat hands-on. A farmer's lot is ever strenuous after all. Extra help is always in order, any morning. Sylvia understood. Sure, she smiled, and the warm sunshine of the day bathed them both in the earthy odours of common concerns. They were tiny figures in a huge expanse. They loved the land in very different ways, but even so, it was a meeting of respectful labours. The Major was not such a bad coot, though he had the deep habits of the army in him, and he swore by superphosphate. Sylvia was not so impractical, though she couldn't see the sense in farm boots, and objected in principle to the chemicals used in drenching and almost every other aspect that defines modern farming, TNT being one of them. Ron, for example, loved the entire operation. There was, in his book, nothing quite as satisfying as blowing tree stumps to kingdom come. If there was one thing the army had taught him, it was the virtue of explosives. Sylvia, on the other hand, would say, "But Ron, don't the tree stumps stabilise the ground and stop erosion?" At which Ron would laugh with genuine delight and shake his head and say, "I don't know where you young people get those sort of ideas. I really don't." In his book, a clean paddock is the very essence. It goes without saying. Therefore, he tucked a big wad of army-grade TNT under a stump, counted to 10, and kaboom! The morning pleasance was suddenly punctuated with loud echoes right down the valley. They were in the back third. Within close hearing distance was the farmhouse of Dale and Celine, other neighbours, who mainly kept to themselves, but had some notion of self-sufficiency, tinkered with windmills, and lived on home-grown polenta. They had creek flats too, but not as fertile as Ron's. They were less accommodating. Dale, who worked for the council, insisted that such practices required a permit, but Ron said fiddlesticks to that, and prudently did most of his blowing when Dale wasn't home. "Hold this, be a good lassie," he said to Sylvia, asking her to help him set a wick. The irony of it was that he would look up and comment on the salubrious glory of the day, the humming of the bees, the warbling of the currajongs, the tittering of the tits, the springing of the springtime, and actually say, "What a beautiful day," and then Kaboom! Blow the living bejesus out of a stubborn stump and disrupt the entire paean with a thundering blast of raw power. Sometimes young Sylvia, longing for the glades, would say, "I just don't get you, Ron," and find him humorously cryptic despite her ideological trappings. Having Ron gone as a neighbour had made her slightly mellow. Barefooted Puritanism doesn't last all the turning seasons. Next came the lambing. This is where Ron really needed her assistance, and where the looming headache of herding hungry Roger found its reciprocation. And several paddocks over, right against the boundary of Dale and Selene, ewes had laboured literally through the night. There were always several in deep trouble. Many popped their lambkins with jolly loping, no worries. Bright white woolies bounced around among the ryegrass and the clover. In some cases, however, the course of nature needed sturdy hands. It was not a delicate midwifery all the same. It was largely a case of Sylvia holding fast upon the ewe and Ron grabbing the lamb by its ankles and dragging it from the unwilling uterus to greet the wide sunny world. Thereupon mother and child would be left to their own devices. One cannot be too precious about mobs of 1,000 sheep. Lambing is a rugged motherhood. It once might have broke poor Sylvia's heart, but farm life puts a muzzle on young sentiments. Instead, there are the rich cycles of blood and sap and sunshine. "There's another one over there, Major," she calls out, pointing. The sheep are not so convenient as to all lamb together. They were perhaps guided by the stars, or at very least their instincts, the stars internalised, and choose a square of throbbing earth. Ron turns around, and just then there comes a peculiar shudder. Clouds gather. The sky turns greasy. Daisies quiver, and it is as if a penumbra passes briefly upon the beating pulse of springtime. A strange stench seeps from the ground. They both notice it and wonder. It is fundamental. But Mother Sheep is bahing in distress among the breezy grassland just gone down, and the sight of blood red staining her white woolen hindquarters is like a blaring hazard sign. There are 5 or 6 others. Baa, baa. "And another one over here, Major," calls out Sylvia furthermore. She steps nimbly on her naked pads. Major Ron plods about the paddock in his gumboots. This is not the way she thought she would be spending her day. Roger had his own determinations. He was still on the creek flats, oblivious in a wild lucerne craze, and would happily eat himself sick if she let him. Farm life sets its own emergencies. Ewes go down and billy goats go astray, even as the very fabric of existence passes with a strange shudder, and man and earth both grow slowly old. It was somewhat afterwards, as Sylvia held tight and Ron tugged the final lambkins from the bloody slime of life, that they saw Selene walking across the paddocks. By seasonal consequences it so happened that she was parallel, which is to say 6 months pregnant with her first. She was rosy-cheeked and rotund. Dale had impregnated her in a fireside cuddle early in the winter. She made jam and pickles while he went a-working. Ron tipped his khaki kook hat and called out, "Good morning," in his snappy army voice, and reckoned it was likely she had come across to complain about explosions again. But her face said otherwise. She approached, her arms wrapped around her bulging belly. "Haven't you heard?" she said, breathless. "It was just on the radio. The great god Pan is dead." Sylvia of the Glades looked up. The ewe she was holding rolled and paid attention too. The newborn lambkin stopped its frolic. Ron just looked at her as if to say, "What?" They were evidently unbelieving, so Selene had to splutter it out again. "It's true," she insisted. "The great god Pan is dead." When this eventually sunk in, Sylvia had the objection, "But the gods are immortal. They can't die by definition," she said, quizzical, confused. It was a straightforward theology. I know, said Celine, but it's happened. And she said it again. The great god Pan is dead. She also said it was an echo being heard all around the world. There was a long consternation. Well, bugger me, said Major Ron softly, who by virtue of his training was previously never known to make such crudities in front of ladies. It's true, Celine pleaded, just in case they might not still believe her, and because the news itself required underlining, since it so plainly violated every perfect norm. But how? Wondered Sylvia. They don't know, said Celine, meaning all the experts, the priests and oracles, the soothsayers and the shamans. Well, it does make sense, Sylvia persisted. I know, said Celine. Her face explained that she had merely bore the news but offered no further insights. That's crazy, Sylvia went on. But it's happened, said Celine. No. Yes, I'm afraid so. Ron, at this point, understood the peculiar shudder and the strange stench, and why the daisies quivered, and why, even more so, the fabric of the sunshine was not as sunny as it was before. He had noticed it was true. Some subtle bubble had changed in the world. Sylvia faced the realisation. Oh, she thought, how am I ever going to tell Roger? Celine, for her part, nursed her big belly. She noticed gravely that her baby had stopped whistling party tunes in the embryonic oceans of its journey. Indeed, she realised that she herself had walked right across the paddocks without whistling so much as several bars, and Ron had lost his whistle, and Sylvia too, and her child would now be born into a grim reality where no one whistles while they walk or work. The blood-dimmed tide was loosed, as they say. It suddenly felt less joyful to be made of flesh. Well, that's dreadful news, said Ron. He could be trusted to sum up situations with direct exactitude. This is a skill that majors learn. Sylvia felt it necessary to sedate the sheep then under her gentle hands. Shh, shh, there, she whispered, since the animal looked anguished, its sad yellow eyes framed with tufts of daggy wool. It was a momentous morning after all. The warble of the currajongs was weakened in its substance. Roger, munching on Ron's delicious greens, had not the slightest inkling. It would come as a terrible shock. The great god Pan, hey? Mused Major. It was like the time that King William died, only cosmic in its amplitude. The three neighbours stood in the tragic essentials of that morning, the ryegrass tapping on their ankles. Only the thistles, which sheep wouldn't eat, found any reason for a rejoicing. Now to render mute the whirling torment, grimace at the travesty, impale the eons on the stake of decay, bewail the slow measures of decline, taste the bitter dew, mess up the starry avenues, gape at the vacuum in the eternal linen, smudge the lanolin sky. O dejected citadel, O drastic earth turn, by the tears of tall Olympus, O crude lamentations in the heaving bosom of the gods. The best thing to do, Ron decided, was to head home for morning tea. They would deal with Roger later. Are you coming? He asked Celine, neighbourly as always. She thought she might, even though she wouldn't usually. They walked back to the farmhouse in quiet study, and when they walked in, Ron called out, "We're back, Yvonne. Have you heard the news?" She had. She was watching it on TV, live from Greece. They sat in the family room and had tea and orange cake as news teams and panels of the mighty discussed the wider repercussions, and controversialists wondered if it had just been an error in translation. Everyone noticed, though, that the savour of life had that morning slipped below their usual perceptions. The tea was not quite as tea-ish anymore. The orange cake was not quite as orangey. This extended into personhood. Yvonne was not quite as Yvonne-y, and the Major wasn't quite as Major. Within a very short time, no one would remember this, but it was intense in the grip of that moment. The Major packed his morning pipe. He had 3 pipes a day, against the doctor's orders. But even the mellow bourbon of the Dutch tobacco seemed lacking, and the joy of defying doctors lost its sting. Celine was right. The echo of the lament, "The great god Pan is dead," resounded everywhere, and the entire universe went into 3 days of solemnities. On Olympus, Zeus called the council. Argive Hera of the white arms watched on with jealous caution. Demeter, she of the grain, bringer of the thesmos, read out all the laws in Linear B. Hermes made his mischief. It was said that Pan had taught him how to play in Ithyphallic rambles. Later, with Roger penned again, Sylvia climbed the hilltop to confront the emptiness, the great ether, and she was moved to stand up upon a great granite overhang and cry at the top of her lungs, "Yo Pan, Yo Pan, Yo Pan," 3 times to the 4 directions. Now there was a new stain upon the world. The same unaccountable dread, strange and original, cosmic even, made her bristle and shiver and want to run, and the hills unfolded with the same agoraphobic menace, and her unforgiving acre in the valley and the shady glades below was a tiny, pathetic, insignificant, temporary little haven among vast and blind forces. But now even the dread was impersonal and shapeless and drearily scientific. The great god Pan was dead. For the first time ever, she felt like wearing shoes.